with the leave of the tribunal, going to present together. We have Associate Professor Tristram Ingham. Dr. Ingham is an Associate Professor at the University of Otago, and his evidence is at H19. And then we have Ms. Bernadette Jones, who is a Senior Kaupapa Māori researcher also at the University of Otago, and her evidence is H18. Now, I've already raised with the tribunal that due to health issues we may need to play it by ear in terms of the presentation. And the other question I was going to seek the leave of the tribunal for was that Dr. Ingham may wish to file written answers after giving evidence if he feels there are some issues that he hasn't been able to properly address in the time available, or he felt that he hasn't had an opportunity to fully articulate his thoughts on the matter. So we have Dr. Ingham and Ms. Jones online, I hope. I can see Dr. Ingham.
Kia ora.
Well, we're going to start with Dr. Ingham's evidence, so maybe I'll say tēnā korua. Dr. Ingham, can you hear us all right?
Absolutely fine, thank you.
Ka pai, well, we can see you up on the giant screen, and we can hear you clearly as well. Tēnā koe, Dr. Ingham, can we start by confirming that your name is Tristram Ingham and that you're an Associate Professor at the University of Otago in Wellington?
Aye, that is correct.
Thank you. And I know that you have a presentation of your evidence today, but before you start, I thought it would be helpful if you could explain to the tribunal the obstacles that have meant you're unable to present in person today.
Aye, kia ora. And with your leave, Ms. Lane, I may just introduce myself first and then do that, if that's all right.
Ka pai. Yes, of course, I'm sorry.
Mahuta ki te pai a tua kiri rangaranga. Rangaranga ki te pō, rangaranga ki te ao. Rangaranga ki te tuakiri o te tangata. Ka puta ki te pai au, ki te ao marama. Ti hei mauri ora. Tēnā koe e te kai whakawā, Judge Stone. Tēnā koutou i ngā mema o te tipu rangatira by Professor Smith, by Simpson. Tēnā korua. Kia koutou ngā tangata whai kaha Māori me o rātou whānau o Aotearoa. Tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Ko Ngāti Kahununu, rāua ko Ngāti Paro o Kuiwi, ko tangata whai kaha Māori ahau, ko Tristram Ingham ahau. I'm a heavy-set, middle-aged man who stands 6 foot, or at least used to, with short dark hair that's increasingly grey. I'm wearing a dark shirt and seated on a black leather chair in my home in Te Whanganui Atara. Kia ora. Yes, absolutely. I wish to firstly convey my apologies to the tribunal for not being able to appear before you in person. It was my sincere desire for that to occur. I believe, furthermore, it was, as a tangata whaikaha Māori, a right in principle to seek justice by appearing in person. However, the systemic barriers of our society in Aotearoa mean that that is not logistically possible. And there is a large degree of mamai that comes with that acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of inadequate care support, inadequate transport access, inadequate accommodation facilities in Tamaki Makaurau, the resurgence of COVID, 3 years of infectious disease pandemic conditions that have separated me from my whānau, most of whom live in Tamaki Makaurau, who I've not actually been able to see in person for 3 years. So it weighs heavy on me to not be there. But I just want to mihi to NHC team and Gabriel Baker in particular for the awhi tautoko and reasonable accommodations that they were able to provide me so that I can at least appear by video link with you today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ko Karen Faint tēnei. Thank you for your mihi and your introduction, Dr. Ingham. So I understand that you have a presentation that you plan to speak to today and that you're going to do that orally rather than via a PowerPoint. So I invite you to address the tribunal.
Kia ora, kia ora. No reira. I present my evidence to the tribunal today based on my lived experience as tangata whaikaha Māori, as a Māori doctor, as an epidemiologist with expertise in addressing health inequities within Māori health, with long-term conditions, disability rights, and in healthcare governance. A summary of my qualifications and experience is provided in my evidence, but perhaps it's most relevant in this forum that again I note that I'm a research associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Otago, based in Wellington, focusing on to research into Māori health, disability and equity. I'm the Tangata Whaikaha Māori co-chair of the Better Outcomes Partnership Board, the tripartite interim partnership structure between the Crown, disabled communities and Tangata Whaikaha Māori for our new ministry, Whaikaha, the Ministry of Disabled People. And I'm also the chairperson of Te Ao Marama Aotearoa Trust, abbreviated as TAMA, a Tangata Whaikaha Māori-led rōpū that aims to promote the rights and interests of Tangata Whaikaha Māori and their whānau and improve health and wellbeing outcomes. Our vision is that the mana of Tangata Whaikaha Māori drives change within whānau, hapū, iwi, and wider social systems, and our passion is shaping a system that honours the aspirations and mana of Tangata Whaikaha Māori and their whānau. Through our work, we seek pai ora for Tangata Whaikaha Māori by contributing to excellent system design, implementation, data collection, and performance monitoring. I should also note that Te Ao Marama Aotearoa is a trust born out of the whakapapa of Te Ao Marama, which was the ministry advisory group for Māori disability within the Ministry of Health, and the group that is responsible for monitoring and oversight of Whaia Te Ao Marama, the Māori Disability Action Plan. So I also want to mihi today to the members of those boards, rōpū and affiliated networks across the motu who walk alongside me in championing the rights of Tangata Whaikaha Māori. I'm presenting evidence to highlight what I see as a lack of government attention to the needs and aspirations of Tangata Whaikaha Māori over decades, equating to a breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi obligations and also of international human rights conventions. The evidence I filed covers 4 main areas. 1, the invisibilization or rendering invisible of Tangata Whaikaha Māori through Crown action and especially inaction. Number 2, the lack of meaningful engagement with Tangata Whaikaha Māori and failure to incorporate our rights, needs, and aspirations in government policy, advice, policy development, and policy analysis. Number 3, the lack of tangata Paikaha Māori involvement in decision making. And 4, some solutions the tribunal could consider in development of recommendations from this inquiry. In my kōrero today, I'll briefly summarise the evidence I've already provided and add commentary on a few matters that have arisen since my evidence was filed. Tuatahi. Firstly, invisibilisation of tangata Paikaha Māori. The Crown does not know who identifies as tangata Paikaha Māori, as no data is collected that allows us to self-identify as who we are. Nor, for that matter, have tangata Paikaha Māori, whānau hoa, Māori with lived experience of disability, as a group or a population, had any meaningful opportunity to develop collective identity that might be measurable. We are not yet a community, but fragmented groups of often disenfranchised individuals and whānau. Furthermore, I contend that the Crown cannot even robustly identify disabled people. No quantitative administrative data is collected that captures the full extent of impairment in Aotearoa, nor are there mechanisms in place to systematically record or understand the mechanisms of societal ableism that exert their influence on us to create disability. Government systems really only identify a subset of disabled people with some types of impairment, such as those who experience significant limitations in one or more of about 5 functional areas, or those who access specific services. Health datasets can only identify around 44,000 disability support service clients, not the broader disabled population of what we understand to be over 1.1 million people in Aotearoa. An important aspect of the invisibilisation we face is that tangata Paikaha Māori are either treated as part of a generic Māori group, which is mostly non-disabled, or part of a large group of people with lived experience of disability, which is mostly non-Māori. This serves to ignore the intersections of Māori identity with lived experience of disability and continues the dominance of colonial knowledge that requires us to fit into a single box. The gaps are long-standing and well recognised. The tribunal noted the minutes inquiry into aspects of the COVID-19 response and recommended that, quote, the Crown prioritise the work to improve quantitative and qualitative data on tangata Paikaha and whānau hoa in partnership with Māori disability care providers and community groups, end quote. Unfortunately, the lack of data evident in the COVID-19 response is not an isolated incident, not a one-off mistake, not merely unfortunate, which is sometimes how the Crown positions it when they talk to us about data. It's so common, occurs in so many areas, and occurs despite robust tangata Paikaha Māori advocacy, that it can only be regarded as deliberate decisions not to prioritise the crucial mahi to ensure quality data. And I'm happy to elaborate on this issue further if the tribunal wish during questions. Following my kōrero, Bernadette Jones, my colleague, will summarise her evidence for the tribunal. I've read her brief and fully tautoko her evidence. We're both leading the University of Otago Te Ao Marama Māori Disability Research Project, which seeks to capture perspectives of tangata Paikaha Māori around disability, to develop culturally appropriate approaches to measuring disability in Māori, and to quantify the prevalence of disability among Māori. This research has been desperately needed and long overdue, especially as questions use the national data collection, this month's census, for example, are neither academically robust for tangata Paikaha Māori, nor culturally validated to incorporate mātauranga Māori concepts. The fact that the Crown has not undertaken this work is further evidence of the breaches I'm addressing today. The Tribunal will also be aware I attached the New Zealand Government's response to the list of issues prior to submission of the second and third periodic review of New Zealand from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD, to my evidence, and that can be found at TI01. This document demonstrates how little meaningful data the government can produce about disabled, let alone being able to break that down by impairment. The document also states the government does not have data on whether a prisoner has disability, which is an issue likely to disproportionately impact Māori, given that Māori make up more than 50% of people in prisons. How can the Crown adequately provide for the health needs, reasonable accommodations, or effective rehabilitation of tangata whaikaha Māori in prisons if these data are not routinely collected or used? Noting that neither the data collection tools nor the agency eligibility criteria for data referred to previously incorporate fetal alcohol syndrome, neurodiversity, or learning disability, which are all overrepresented among these same Māori prisoners. I contend that the wholesale exclusion of such people who clearly meet the international human rights definitions of disability from the opportunity to claim that identity is evidence itself about how we are systematically invisibilised as tangata whaikaha Māori. I note that in August 2022, the UNCRPD Committee considered our independent monitoring mechanism report in Geneva. Despite the clear issues surrounding the full expression of rights of tangata whaikaha Māori, there is no officially mandated tangata whaikaha Māori partner within the IMM, and consequently, there were no tangata whaikaha Māori amongst the delegates supported by the government to attend. Through personal advocacy and at my own expense, I was able to record a statement on behalf of tangata whaikaha Māori that was played in a closed session of the committee. In my statement, I do raise concerns similar to those outlined in my summary so far, including that the New Zealand government tends to ignore the intersecting power structures that impact tangata whaikaha Māori and instead focus on disabled people and Māori communities as two separate homogenous populations. I note the UN Committee's concluding observations gave specific recommendations to address issues affecting tangata whaikaha Māori. I commend those recommendations particularly, and indeed all of the recommendations of the UN Committee. I urge the Tribunal to consider endorsing the UNCRPD recommendations as a means to recognise and reinforce these international legal commitments as domestic commitments to tangata whaikaha Māori under Te Treaty o Waitangi. Secondly, government policy advice, development, and analysis. In my experience, government policy advice does not adequately consider issues for tangata whaikaha Māori, and that limits its robustness and impact. As I presented in my written evidence, all Cabinet papers for the Cabinet Social Wellbeing Committee are required to include a disability perspective statement that considers the impacts of policies and proposals on disabled people. In practice, this is often limited to a cursory review, sometimes with less than 30 minutes turnaround by an official in the Office for Disability Issues. There is almost never robust tangata whaikaha Māori community input. Indeed, even access to the paper prior to Cabinet submission is the exception rather than the rule. In my various roles, I have had experience reviewing and providing comment on some Cabinet papers, and I observe that these statements tend to lack analysis of issues faced by and the diverse realities experienced by tangata whaikaha Māori, instead presenting things as often monochromatic and ignoring again the intersecting power structures that might additionally impact Māori with lived experience of disability. Government officials are provided with a disability toolkit, or at least one's available for them, for policy to assist in preparing cabinet papers. And the toolkit, which is publicly available, outlines those 7 steps. 1, thinking about disability issues at the start of the policy process. 2, engaging with the disability community. 3, embedding disability into the policy issue. 4, incorporating disability into policy options. 5, incorporating disability into cabinet papers. 6, considering disability throughout implementation. And 7, considering how disability outcomes can be monitored and evaluated. Now, in Table 1 of my evidence, I provide observations on each of these stages. My overall observation is that there's inadequate direction for policy analysts on understanding tangata Paekaha Māori needs and aspirations, on working in partnership with tangata Paekaha Māori, on designing solutions that address inequities that unfairly and unjustly impact tangata Paekaha Māori, and on providing free and frank advice on the potential impacts of policy decisions on tangata Paekaha Māori. All in all, it's hard to conclude anything other than the policy processes we rely on in Aotearoa to ensure the needs and aspirations of different population groups are incorporated into the device, do not serve, and were never designed to serve tangata Paekaha Māori. It certainly does not even vaguely approach the level of input and partnership expected under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, nor under Article 4.3 of the UN CRPD. In my written evidence, I also highlight the Health and Disability System Review as an example of a very recent policy process that did not adequately include the voices of tangata Paekaha Māori. In my evidence, I provide an analysis of the review panel's final report, which includes the observation that in the 264-page document, tangata Paekaha Māori are referenced only 4 times. The overwhelming silence on issues relevant to tangata Paekaha Māori concerned me and my fellow Tama members enough to write to ministers seeking to have a discussion on our analysis. A copy of these letters are attached to my evidence at TI 07. We did not receive an official response to our concerns. Despite the concerns I've outlined about the Health and Disability System Review and the shortcomings of the Paiora Act, which provides very little in the way of safeguards for tangata Paekaha Māori interests, I know many of us have still been hopeful that things will change through the reforms that were made formal in 2022. And while there are undoubtedly some positives in the new arrangements, the issues I've identified around policy process appear to continue. For example, the Paiora legislation requires the development of several health sector strategies, including a New Zealand health strategy, a Māori health strategy, a health of disabled people strategy, a Pacific health strategy, a women's health strategy, and a rural health strategy. The Paiora legislation also sets out a series of health sector principles that include engaging with Māori to develop, deliver, and monitor services and programs designed to improve Paiora Māori outcomes. However, as chair of Tama, I only found out 2 weeks ago that public consultation on most of these strategies closed on the 17th of March this year. And as a national organisation representing and advocating for tangata Paekaha Māori, and with the whakapapa of that established partnership relationship with Paekaha and the Ministry of Health, we've only received 1 email from officials, and this was regarding the Health of Disabled People strategy. We did not receive any offer of resource, co-design opportunity, nor even notification of in-person sessions around the motu on the Māori health strategy. To be blunt, I don't believe there has been meaningful engagement with tangata Paekaha Māori on any of these strategies. I've written to the Director General of Health to seek urgent kōrero on how we as the rōpū and the community can meaningfully engage on these strategies from this point onwards, but have yet had to have a response. While I'm hopeful that we'll find a resolution and a way forward, I'm disheartened that the new way of doing things has actually continued the old ways of excluding tangata whaikaha Māori. The third point in my kōrero today, the lack of tangata whaikaha Māori involvement in governance and decision making. In my view, addressing the invisibilisation of tangata whaikaha Māori in government policy and practice and monitoring requires tangata whaikaha Māori involvement in governance and decision-making roles across the public sector. UNCRPD Article 4.3 specifies that the Crown shall, quote, closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, through their representative organisations, end quote. It further clarifies the scope of situations requiring that level of involvement as, quote, in the development and implementation of legislation and policies to implement the Convention, and in other decision-making processes concerning issues relating to persons with disabilities, end quote. Well, that's essentially at all levels of every government ministry, Crown entity, and agency. And unfortunately, there are no mechanisms that require tangata whaikaha Māori to be at the decision-making tables in the health sector, excepting a small provision in the Pai Ora Act, which requires the Minister of Health to have regard for the need for the Hauora Māori Advisory Committee to represent the perspectives of organisations that hold system-level insights in relation to the needs and aspirations of Māori health consumers, including, for example, tangata whaikaha. There is no data publicly available on the numbers of tangata whaikaha Māori on boards of Crown health entities or groups, or in leadership roles in health and disability sector agencies. Dr. Paula King, in her evidence, managed to access some of this information through the Official Information Act, but at the time, there were no Māori board members with lived experience of disability on DHB boards. The situation, though it appears to me to be unfair and unjust, is the unsurprising result of legislation that has no requirement for tangata whaikaha Māori representation of groups that make decisions about their health and disability services. I know the former Disability Rights Commissioner had requested updated information from the Ministry of Health on the numbers of disabled people on boards of Crown health entities and other groups broken down by ethnicity. I've yet to see any response come through. And similarly, I understand that Crown Law have been asked to provide updated figures through the discovery process, though again, I've not seen figures on board members.
Dr. Ingham, can I just stop you there, because the kawa is to have a 5-minute break every half hour, so if you're happy to have a 5-minute refresher, we'll be back.
Touchstone speaking. Thank you, Ms. Faint. Let's take our 5-minute break and come back at 12:38. Tēnā koutou, ko Judge Stone tēnei, nau mai hoki mai. Judge Stone speaking, welcome back. Handing it back to you, Ms. Fain.
Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Ingham, I invite you to finish your presentation.
No, kia ora, whaia. So the fourth section in my kōrero today is a few comments about solutions. The health and disability framework needs to change in ways that are developed in partnership with tangata whaikaha Māori. In turn, this has the potential to ensure tangata whaikaha Māori are able to demonstrate self-determination, that the Crown ensures equity and active protection, and provides options for tangata whaikaha Māori as we access a range of culturally appropriate, clinically safe, and non-disabling health and disability services. I've outlined in some detail proposed solutions in my evidence brief, but in summary, I see the following solutions as critical. We need to urgently remedy the invisibilisation of tangata whaikaha Māori in official data sources. The Te Ao Marama Research Project that my colleague Bernadette Jones will talk about will provide an evidence base for government to collect appropriate disability data, for example, through the census. In the meantime, Stats NZ needs to disaggregate the disability data they've collected in their data sets, including this month's census, by ethnicity and impairment as a minimum. As I say in my evidence, my understanding is that they do not intend to disaggregate data in this way, despite the fact they could do so. Remedying this invisibilisation also involves establishment and recognition of tangata whaikaha Māori data sovereignty, as well as the resourcing to have our own tools and methods to collect, analyse, visualise, and disseminate data. 2. Tangata whaikaha Māori need the opportunity to develop collective voice and identity around disability, a national kōrero. This includes a kōrero about the constitutional relationship between tangata whaikaha Māori and the Crown, and a kōrero about how we reclaim and use our own tikanga and own mātauranga. I imagine this kōrero as analogous to the inspirational work of Dr. Moana Jackson, Margaret Mutu, and the Working Group on Constitutional Transformation that led to Mātiki Mai. In fact, the theory of change that underpins my call for a national kōrero is based on a belief in the transformational change of tangata whaikaha Māori being able to exercise our mana motuhake. In my view, the prerequisites and features of a national kōrero would include that the Crown implement General Comment number 7 of the UNCRPD to appropriately recognise and resource disabled persons organisations, especially tangata whaikaha Māori, rōpū, whānau, and hāpū, under Article 4.3 of the UNCRPD. That significant investment in community-commissioned capability and capacity development be made to enable tangata whaikaha Māori to have sufficient life bandwidth to even engage. The leadership of this national taumata of tangata whaikaha Māori needs to be inclusive, pan-iwi, and pan-impairment, and it must be appointed by, led by, and represent tangata whaikaha Māori and support inclusion of our whānau. That the kōrero itself must be resourced fairly and equitably by the Crown. That there be strong engagement from the Crown at a ministerial level, with support from key agencies, including Whaikaha, Oranga Tamariki, Ministry of Education, Te Aka Whai Ora, Te Whatu Ora, and the Ministry of Health, along with others. And finally, that tangata whaikaha Māori are guaranteed a mandated role in the IMMs of the UNCRPD, UNDRIP, and UNCROC. Developing this national corridor will take considerable time, though, and require work to build community amongst tangata Waikato Māori and respond to what I might describe as the trauma we experience as tangata Waikato Māori from being systematically excluded across most aspects of government activity. Thirdly, health and disability agencies and ministers need to take immediate action to iteratively improve the current health system. So this includes legislative change and process improvements around board appointments to ensure high-level participation by tangata Waikato Māori. 2, funding tangata Waikato Māori communities to come together and network in ongoing ways. 3, ensuring health sector agencies are held to account for their performance in implementing the health sector strategy and policy, and associated with this, any monitoring needs to be shared in transparent ways that are accessible to tangata Waikato Māori. Fourthly, improving commissioning and contracting practices for health services to ensure they meet the needs and aspirations of tangata Waikato Māori. Now, this might include things like whether it's appropriate for for-profit organisations to benefit from the commoditisation of tangata Waikato Māori, and whether it's appropriate for the Crown to contract with organisations that don't have inclusive employment policies and practices. We need to address the underfunding of Māori health providers and communities to ensure they are adequately funded to meet the needs and aspirations of tangata Waikato Māori. We need to support career pathways for tangata Waikato Māori directly by prioritising tangata Waikato Māori workforce development, including supporting tangata Waikato Māori to practice as kaupapa Māori researchers, providing fair contracts to kaupapa Māori providers so they're able to offer sustainable employment opportunities to Waikato Māori and provide fair pay and other considerations. And this would also include removing ableist barriers to inclusion of tangata Waikato Māori in health professions, including through the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act. So I conclude this summary of my evidence by emphasising that I believe the solutions to the situation we find ourselves in, where Crown actions and inactions have disadvantaged and rendered invisible tangata Waikato Māori, requires courageous transformational change. And while there's scope to make immediate and tangible improvements, including to health sector policy, I just can't stress enough how widespread the problems are with the government's approach to Māori health and disability. In fact, the hardest part of preparing this evidence for this inquiry was picking what I would raise. The sheer number of examples and specific issues I've personally experienced or been made aware of in the roles I sit in is frankly exhausting to even contemplate. Ultimately, what's needed is for the concepts that we label as health and disability to be completely turned on their heads so that we can instead focus on hauora and mana motohake. We should be creating our own uniquely Aotearoa approach, shaped by tangata Waikato Māori and built on Māori worldviews and mātauranga. Then we'll get to experience the true potential of concepts like whānau ora and to have our needs and aspirations as tangata Waikato Māori met by government services that for decades have ignored and invisibilised us. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Karen, thanks